Okay. Yeah, and I call it the fog we breathe because it's something that we're not really aware of, and we're constantly inhaling all the cultural biases and systemic biases that come our way, and they're just part of the air that we breathe. Um, and as a consultant working with corporations, I spent most of my life working above the surface on policies, procedures, on training, hiring criteria, and things like that. And they really don't get at this, this undercurrent, very deep undercurrent of implicit bias and stereotype threat. I will spend more time on implicit bias since people ask me to, but I think they go hand in hand because implicit bias is typically what people of privilege worry about if they're of good conscience. Stereotype threat is what people who don't have privilege typically worry about, whether they realize it or not. Though they both apply to you, whatever your whatever category you'd put yourself in. And I want to emphasize, because we may hit on some raw nerves, at no point am I suggesting that because someone has experiences implicit bias or stereotype threat, that equates to explicit prejudice. And I think that's an important thing to regard. Explicit prejudice should be met forcefully. But that can work against you if you're dealing with an implicit bias where often the person wants very much not to have that prejudice. But the effects are both very similar. Implicit bias is a lot harder to get rid of in some ways. And so it's all the more important to focus on. Just to bring people up to speed, implicit bias, it's any associations that you make without thinking about it. And if I say peanut butter, you'll probably say jelly. Some might say honey. If I say ham, and you'll probably complete that with eggs. But it can apply to a lot of different things. And in a corporate world, we talk about affinity bias, which is an affinity to a desire just to spend time with people that you're comfortable with, that you feel an affinity with. And that could be based on race, political party, your religion. And we won't cover all these, but I just wanted to stress that there are lots of ways that our mind forms these associations. Height, we often subconsciously assume that taller people are more competent. That beautiful people are more competent, earn more, should get more attention. And there's no reason to think that other than it's just a bias, because we actually don't know anything about that person if that's the only thing we know about them. And I'll talk about that more, how little we actually know about each other. But ageism is a common issue. People over 45 start to feel that their opportunities narrow, that they're passed over for more and more promotions. At 55, that really accentuates. And in spite of the fact that they haven't lost their qualifications. I'm happy to come back to any of these if people want to talk about examples of those or to share some of their own experiences. Name bias, people who have an Anglophilic name, it's particularly a white male Anglophilic name, are far more likely to get callbacks for interviews, to get promotions. But I want to give a couple of examples, and one of my favorite involves symphony orchestras. And in the 60s and early 70s, about 6% of the members of orchestras were women. And in an effort to overcome that, they said, let's move to blind auditions. And what's most interesting, to cut to the chase, over a period of 3 decades, the percentage of women rose to the point where it's 30 to 50% in the major symphony orchestras. And a lot of credit for that is given to the blind auditions. what I found most interesting was when they first tried this, it didn't make much of a difference. And then someone noticed that most women showed up to their auditions in high heels. And even though you, the judge, were sitting there with your back to them so you couldn't see them, you could hear the click, 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 clack of high heels. And so they then asked candidates to take their heels off or their shoes off. And they started to notice an improvement there. So here was just something, even though you had a blind process, just this subtle cue of high heels cued the judges that they were listening to a woman. In our society, and each of you, I would bet, have very different associations when you see someone of the cloth. My father's a minister, and so I grew up in the church. Since transitioning, I have to confess that my emotions have changed a lot because I've just felt very attacked, and I no longer feel safe when I walk into a church. And I'm not saying I'm not safe, but my back just goes up, and I'm frightened. And it's because a lot of what I hear are from people who say very hateful things. And what you'll find, what's important for this conversation isn't whether ministers are a menace or a moral guide. It's the fact that people form very emotional, deep feelings when they see someone in a collar. And without knowing anything about that person, they immediately make inferences about them. And that often divides us more than anything. We may have the same values, but we make very different assumptions based on visual cues. And then this is one that, and I'll confess, I still, when I see this, I have a little bit of a reaction, even though I know better. The gentleman on the left is William Adosai, who's the founder of Vitae. It's a very successful watch company in England. He supports children in sub-Saharan Africa. Been a very successful entrepreneur. And the gentleman on the right is David Lammy. He is a member of parliament in the UK. And these two are two of 58 men, Black men who, all of them very successful, and they all posed in the media with hoodies because they wanted to change that perception. And yet I would bet that a lot of people have that implicit bias that if they see that image, they feel fearful. And the cost to the people who are at the receiving end of that bias is huge. And just, this is taking one example in the job market. Someone did a study and they looked at, if I'm a gay man in England versus a straight man, how many more years of education and employment experience do I need before I have the same statistical likelihood of getting the same job with someone with whom I otherwise share the same qualifications? And the same thing, they looked at women in technology in both the US and in Asia. And then they monetized that and looked at the additional money you had to spend on school, your lost earnings, the number of years you had to wait because of school, before you could get a job. And for the gay man in England, it wasn't too bad. It cost them $54,000 to have that identity. In the US, a woman in the tech industry, depending on what part of it, it was $100,000 to $300,000. And this professor, Adrian Ming, called this a tax. So it was a tax on being a woman that was $100,000 to $300,000. In Hong Kong, it was much higher. If you were a woman, it was about $1 million. But you could apply this in receiving medical care. In the United States, Black women in particular, we just have a terrible record of care for diagnosis for Black women in our healthcare system. It also, but it affects people in jobs and healthcare, in our penal system. And I don't think that's new, so I won't dwell on that, but it's a very heavy burden. And a lot of that is implicit bias. I want to talk for a minute about stereotype threat, which is kind of the other side of the coin. And this is what I definitely learned about when I transitioned. And it's the notion of stereotype threat is that when you're suddenly in a room surrounded by people and you feel conscious of that you represent some stigmatized minority, your mind enters into overload, and it profoundly affects not only your health, but your performance. And there've been a lot of studies of this using test scores, grades, graduation rates, athletic performance, musical performance. And just in one example, on standardized tests, what they would do is they would have one group of people just go in and take the test with no cues. And then they would go in and with another group of people, and they'd say to the girls as they went in and the boys as they went in, we're using this test to look at the difference in performance between men and women. So they cued in their mind as they were taking this test, I'm being measured based on my being a girl or a boy. And you can see that between those two groups, their performance, and I wouldn't compare the blue to the red. What's more important is the slope of each of the curves. For the girls, if they were put in the low stereotype threat environment where they were not reminded that this was being used as a test of boys versus girls, their performance scores went up. And for boys, it went up in the opposite situation. And this has been the most interesting for me is the one on the right, where they took three groups, and these were women, and some of them they cued as they went in to take this. I believe this was a math test. They cued them and just said, this is being tested, used to test Asians versus white Americans. And a second group, they said nothing. And a third group, they said this is being used to test whether you're female. I'm sorry, not whether you're female, to test women and men and their relative performance. And again, you can see that in math, Asians have a reputation, a stereotype for being better at math. And so their scores actually went up. And for women who were primed with the notion that this was being used to test the impact of their being a woman, their performance went down. It's been studied, I think, most in racial data, and that you'll see on the left. Again, standardized test scores, looking at stereotype threat and no stereotype threat, and you can see a significant improvement. What's going on, and this I experienced, this is really important to corporate executives because you want to get the most out of your employees. And I transitioned in New York City at a big corporation. They were very supportive, so I can't lay anything at their feet. But when I came back to work, in spite of their support, I suddenly froze. And so this person who used to walk in and just command a room would suddenly go, wait a minute, why did they call on me? Why didn't she sit next to me? Did someone ask me that because I'm trans? Or if I offered an opinion on something, I'd say, maybe I better not speak up right now. And I started sitting on my hands. And I got to live this. And what changed it for me was really my colleagues who just every day they'd welcome me and, Tina, how are you? How's Mary doing? And they just focused on my humanity. It began to draw me back out of myself, and I began to bring my A game back to work. Because if you don't, and this is what I felt when I'd be sitting in meetings, just very quiet, I'd avoid certain projects and people. I'd feel exhausted. I'd sit on my ideas. I'd avoid social events. And So stereotype threat, and the reason I want to emphasize it is even if there is no implicit bias in the room, so if everyone in this call cured themselves of implicit bias, what you need to understand is that if someone is feeling stereotype threat because they don't know what bias you might be feeling, they don't know what's in your head, all of this is happening to them. And so it's not enough just to say, I want to be better. You have to think about, how do I make a corporate environment or a work environment that feels welcoming, and how do I recognize when someone might feel, for whatever reason, that they're at risk of being judged differently from others. And it's because it's very real to them, and it's very debilitating. Let me just pause for a minute because I want to move now to the causes and really spend more of our time talking about what do you do about this. But are there any questions or comments about stereotype threat or implicit bias?
I just wanted to say it was fascinating. I never thought about it from that perspective, that stereotype bias can happen even when there is no implicit bias. So thank you. That was great.
You're welcome. There's a great book called Whistling Vivaldi. And it got its name because there was at Yale in the 1970s, had very few Black students on campus, but Yale is situated inside a ghetto. And so the white people on campus were always skittish if they saw someone of color walking across campus. And so there was this Black student who majored in classical music. And he found that if he just whistled Vivaldi while he walked across campus, everyone around him relaxed. And so there he was with no clear cues, but just changing his behaviors, adapting so that he would feel safe walking across campus and make others feel safe. And so it's something that, and I try to remind myself if I'm facing, I'm often counseling people in my own community, transgender people, and some of them get very edgy, get rude, and I try to remind myself, they're probably coming from a place of fear where they're walking in a community where they are. When I transitioned and I would walk in New York City, I not only worried about whether someone would beat me up, but for the first time in my life, I worried, and again, for no reason, but I was terrified, gee, that policeman over there, if he sees me getting beat up, will he come help me or will he lend a boot? And it's just, your mind is just flooded with this overload of worries. And it's really hard to appreciate what that's like unless you try to put yourself in a situation where you are a decided minority. And that's where they found that if they had one woman in a room of 20 men taking a test, her scores on average would be lower than if they had 5 or 10 women in the room. And it's feeling and that's why I think representation is very important. It does help to address stereotype threat in a way that other policies don't. Any other comments or questions?
Yes, this is Lakivia Johnson. So I spent some time in the foster care system later as a teenager. My mom, she was a social worker, so I can kind of relate to what you're saying with your dad being a pastor and kind of going through a transition, but I didn't realize that there was so much bias and stereotype associated with that at a younger age. At that age, I'm like way older now, but we aren't really taught that stuff. But now these conversations are coming to light more, and I can recognize how that was an issue there, that really just makes people uncomfortable. And it's something that we're not ever really able to escape from, so to speak. So I'm happy to take part in this conversation. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And again, one of the reasons I wanted to present both is I think we often look to ourselves when we're, how do we fix this? How do I fix myself? How do I fix my company? And sometimes it's just acknowledging and being with that person where they are. And again, what helped me more than anything, and we often talk about allies as political activists and protectors, but that would have been my definition before I transitioned. When I transitioned, and I was in a non-hostile environment for the most part, I realized that my real allies were just the people who just greeted me and made me feel connected again, because I really felt unconnected from humanity for a while there, and very worried. And I think it's important to see that side as well, that it's not always on us. It is on us to help address and make people feel welcome. I also think it's important to recognize that both of these behaviors are very human. They're not going to go away. You can moderate them. There are a lot of things you can do about them, but they are how we are built. We have tribal ancestry, and back then tribes mattered a lot, and you would say it's them or us, and so us and them, has some strong biological components that may not be as relevant today, but they're with us. Our minds seek out patterns. I've experienced a number of times, one time in a store, this young boy came up to me and said, "Excuse me, sir, could you tell me where the milk is?" And I knew they weren't trying to insult me, because they were asking for my help, and they were so polite. And I just realized, okay, now here I'm doing my own stereotyping. This is an 18-year-old male who's full of hormones and is just focused on my shoulders. And so that's the first thing they think of. And whereas invariably, if I'm talking to a woman in her 40s, she's more focused on my style and my dress and hair. And so our minds seek out patterns, and each of us pick different patterns. And we can learn about that, but we can never completely eliminate, and nor would we want to eliminate pattern seeking. Our minds like to take shortcuts. I would be exhausted if I had to process everything about every person every minute of the day. But again, I can start to learn about systemic shortcuts that maybe are not, that are creating systemic injustices and poor performance in a business. And then we have lots of social and cultural influences. I worry that, we used to be hunted by animals. Now we're hunted by the media. I mean, just everywhere I go, someone wants to influence my opinion. There are logos on toilet paper now. I mean, just everywhere you go, it's there. And it's hard not to let those memes influence how your mind thinks. And then finally, a really important one that is important to embrace is this fear of being judged. And I think often we work to our great detriment when we get too defensive and judgmental. When someone mispronouns me, if I think it's intentional, I will get angry. If it's not, I relax, because I want them to relax and just recognize, again, their mind seeking out patterns. My mother, God bless her, would so embrace my gender, but would constantly mispronoun me. And then she overcorrected. So now she she recently died, but until then, she would mispronoun all my siblings, and she'd get mine right, because in her mind, she said, whatever you're thinking, say the opposite. And that's just how our mind works. What I want to talk about are the things that we can do. And here I'm going to step away from all the professional advice. There are lots of policies, procedures, and metrics, training guides, video games, and I'm not saying they don't work, but they've met with much more limited success than I think people hope for, and they weren't long lasting necessarily. And I think it's because you can go into a training, or you can do any one of these, and then you return back to your real world and all of the stimuli that you had before. And again, this is all happening beneath the surface. So it's not the rational policy level that's operating. And so I want to offer from my personal experience, without studies, but with a lot of conviction, what I think makes a world of difference if you really want to address these. and I again invite people to chime in. To me, the most important, number one, is to change who you lunch with. I was talking to executive vice president of HR at a New York bank, and they had tried everything to change their interview process. You were required to have at least one minority candidate in the first round, and they added all these procedures and policies, and people took to them. They really tried to implement it. It didn't change anything, not by much. And then they realized their networks hadn't changed. So the executive might interview 3 people, but they'd had lunch and they'd met one of the candidates at a party, and so they just felt more comfortable. And it wasn't conscious. It wasn't that they wanted to. They just felt more at ease interviewing that person. They felt more at ease or familiar with their answers. And so they set about trying to change who they lunched with, who they networked with. In a recent study by the Brookings Institute, they found, it's really, the whole study goes into a lot more than just racial networks. It goes to other aspects of networks. But in Charlotte, most whites have a network of only whites, only whites. In DC, 90% of white men's job networks were all white. And just think that can't help but influence or affect how you make snap judgments, who you call for help, who you offer help to. It's not intentional, but as long as our society lives with that degree of separation. I was visiting Winches, and the person I was meeting with, that's Western North Carolina Community Health Services, they picked up the phone, and it was, they're Hispanic, and it was someone on the other end was Hispanic, and they needed a job. And that person, I got to listen in as they thought about all the jobs they might find for them. And I realized they were all networked within the Spanish kitchen community. They had no access to my network, and it would never have occurred to him to ask me or me to go search that out. So I don't think we appreciate how deeply these informal networks magnify themselves into a lot of issues. And this is on the left, that's some of you may know Lafrida Brown Morris. She is my best friend. On my right is my left is my wife. But I've really, since moving to Asheville, the biggest thing I worked at was to change who I socialized with. And it didn't mean eliminating friends, but it meant expanding my friendships, expanding the people I offered help to in the neighborhood. And it's been transformational. And Lafrida said I can share these sorts of things. She can be down and honest with me and tell me exactly what she thinks of something I said, or kind of how she thinks about something. I have other neighbors who are not white and privileged that I spend a lot of time with. And I've learned so much that I never would learn from either textbooks, newspaper articles, and they sink in at a very deep level. And I can't think of anything that has had a more profound influence on both my growth as a person and on my ability. I got a call from a leader in the Latinx community yesterday wanting Quentin Miller's cell phone number. And I happened to be good friends with Quentin. And so I contacted Quentin. Is it okay to share this? And this was because of a hate crime. That never would have happened 3 years ago. And so here she was reaching out to a white person to connect with the sheriff. And Mary and I, we got involved in politics. And so we started having some receptions, and we really mixed them up. And it was fascinating to see people walk in the door and they do a double take because they saw suddenly, whether they were white, black, or Hispanic or Asian, they didn't mind. They just didn't expect to see that mix of people in the room. And we've come to love that. It's just, we also came to realize how rare that is, that we usually say, well, let's get the Murphys with the Joneses because they both have, we're not trying to be racist, but in trying to, again, pair like with like, we too often deepen those tendencies. Who have you given help to in the past 3 months? Who have you turned to for help? Again, I always justified and said, well, I help people come and ask me, but the only people who were coming and ask me were the people who had access to my network, who happened to be white. And that's changed. And the biggest thing that's changed is me turning to them for help, because people like to help. And I think that created deeper friendships across traditional divides when I asked them for help, because they felt wanted. So again, we talk about training and sort of some magic dust. I think it really is looking honestly at where do you spend your time? One of the candidates for city council asked a wonderful question. She said, how many Black friends do you have? And there was just dead silence in the audience. And she was asking for their votes, but here she was encouraging them to think about that. So I'd encourage people to think about that, however you think of not like you. Memoirs, and I want to speak in particular of memoirs by people who are willing to be vulnerable and share their struggles. I've read a number of memoirs that are more self-congratulatory. White is a State of Mind. I'm ashamed to say I picked it up thinking that it was a book for white people. It is actually a book by Melba Patilla Beals, who some of you may know. She was one of the Arkansas Nine, one of the children who integrated the schools in Arkansas. It became so dangerous, not only from the white community, but from her own community who were losing jobs over this. They moved her to California to live with a white family. And so this was her second memoir, which is about that second half of her childhood living in a white neighborhood in Los Angeles. And I learned so much about her just struggle with identity. Trevor Noah, whenever I visit a country, I try to find something by a minority there, because that's often more approachable, because I don't feel threatened by I'm causing this. In Trevor's book on what it was like to grow up Black or colored, he would say, in South Africa, was just mind-opening. When they call you a terrorist, I had seen Patrice Kankalur on TV many times where she was forced into a sort of battle mode, and I never warmed up to her. I liked her, but I didn't warm up. When I read her memoir, where she just talked about what it was like growing up as a little girl and seeing what happened to her big brothers and things, I wept. And it really humanized her to a level that all these books on statistics and policies can never touch you that deeply. When I went to Australia, I bought about 6 books by Aboriginal people, and they were just, it was just wonderful to hear their experiences and really nice. So I encourage you, if you can't be networking, just get to know people through very real stories. It really humanizes them, and I think gets below the cerebral cortex into the lower part of your mind. I deal with this both. Don't try to be what you aren't. I see this as a trans person when someone comes up to me and tries to be normal, when I can tell they're not. I mean, they're a little freaked out. They have questions in their mind, and they don't want to say anything, and they try to make it sound like everything's just normal. I hate that. I do the same thing, though, when I'm approaching, if I'm feeling in an uncomfortable situation, I'm approaching a person of color, I'll suddenly try to go into hypernormal mode, and I can just see they're just kind of going like, oh. I prefer it when someone is just honest and it comes to me from where they are in that moment, because then we can both move forward together. And this is where stereotype threat works the other way around, where people of privilege feel threatened. It's, oh my God, if I say what I'm really thinking, if I ask the question I'm really want to ask, what are they going to think of me? Oh, if I mentor that woman, is someone going to make a comment about me? And so a lot of the doors closed to privilege because people in privilege worry that any efforts they make to reach across the aisle might be misunderstood. And has anyone on the call dealt with that from either side?
Tina, I'll speak. I think that also happens so often with individuals with disabilities, particularly those that, individuals in a wheelchair, and, it's that awkwardness that individuals don't know what to do. And most people are well-intended. So it's not about intention, of course, but the impact on others. So I'm learning so much by what we can do, which I was hoping you would cover. So thank you for going into detail about this.
And I think this is too subtle. Don't think about the rainbow pancakes. If someone says, don't think about X, you will think about X. And so if you say, don't think about race, you will be thinking about race. And again, that's why it's, you should be conscious and sensitive, but don't try to pretend that you've arrived at some level of wisdom that you haven't. We all have a right to be where we are at the moment. The real question is, are we willing to move forward? And are we eager to do that? And that's how I judge people. Is I've come to welcome if someone wants to have a conversation about my gender. I wouldn't think about my gender at all if everyone else didn't think about it. But I'm happy to talk about it because it moves them forward.
Tina, can we get your thoughts on something else too in this midst of cancel culture? You mentioned the word earlier, fear. And my sense is that with the cancel culture, people are so much more fearful today to have those dialogues across difference than they were, say, even 5 years ago. Do you have a perspective on that?
Yeah, I do. When I grew up in the 50s and 60s, wow, that's depressing. Every town had 2 newspapers. There were 3 TV channels. And there is a saying, the medium is the message. And the point was, with 3 TV channels, if I wanted to get public attention, I had to take my message and get it in through one of those 3 filters. And each of those was going for 33% of the market share. So they only wanted to present what felt kind of normal. And that had on the plus side, perhaps, a great moderating influence. On the other hand, people like me could never have been ourselves back then because all the messages in society were pushing us all to conform to one of a few models or one of a couple of parties. And now with thousands of channels, if you want attention, if you want a public attention, you can only get that by being outrageous, by being unusual. And so now our minds are constantly drawn towards very extreme messages. And I'm not saying that they're wrong, but that's kind of the constant diet that we're fed, are these very binary messages, which is somewhat ironic given how much choice there is out there. And I think the cancel culture comes in part from that, is this, again, it's not stereotype threat, there's a different name for that, but it's identity threat, where you feel that your group's identity is politically threatened. And if you don't take strong measures right now, draw a line in the sand, you will lose 30 years of progress. And that goes through a lot of people's minds. And so we're all out there, pointed sticks in hands, our hard-won territory. And that's true whether you're a right-wing Christian, I'm generalizing, or a queer person from the far left. I see as much stereotyping from either side by some individuals. I don't mean by everyone in the community, but they tend to have very loud voices. I felt running Blue Ridge Pride, my biggest challenge has been working with people who feel betrayed if I reach across the aisle. But we consider that you do need, a movement needs people who make the world uncomfortable and call things out. It also needs people who are peacemakers and who connect. And my worry about cancel culture, I think we need to hear anger, but I worry that sometimes we shout out the groups that are trying to reach across the aisle and achieve change in other ways. I'm very aware, Dr. King, he felt very betrayed by white liberals who really didn't step up their game. And so again, I don't think that we should all be, peacemakers. I think it's yin and yang, and so I'm happy to see people with very strong voices, but I do worry about cancel culture. We have in our own community, Human Rights Campaign, their president was just fired, and he was fired. It's not clear why he was fired because it's not in writing, but he was associated with Mario Cuomo before he joined the Human Rights Campaign. And do I think that he should or shouldn't have been fired? I don't know. I do know that we didn't have a lot of facts that were trotted out there that I would have liked, but it's hard if you're from a minority community that feels, again, that's why I go back to the stereotype thread. If you're fearful, I try to conjure up an image. I try to put myself in a country where I would be terrified if I were walking the streets every day, where I would be looking over my shoulder, and I just try to think, how would I think about this issue? And I think some of us, particularly those who live more comfortably, just don't appreciate how deep those and raw those emotions can be. And I don't have an issue with, for lack of a better term, rank and file who feel that way. I do have an issue with leaders who play to that, and I think there are a lot of leaders on both sides who, to sustain or to strengthen their leadership position, they appeal to hate and to stereotype, and that I think we, again, we need to speak up against our leaders when they do that. And whether you're in a conservative church, most of the people I know who are Baptists, I get along wonderfully with them. They're nice people. I wish they would speak up against some of the bullies in their culture, but I have the same issue in the LGBT community, where I have some people who are just angry and who don't want me talking to police, and I have to tell them, no, I will I will talk to them. I also have to listen. It's very hard to be in a position, as a lot of leaders are, whether it's of companies or social service organizations, who have to hold their organization together while they're dealing with people who don't want to have one opinion on COVID and people who have another, and they're bringing all that to work. It's a very, I'm sorry, I gave a very long answer to that question, but it's a real problem. And I think it starts with policing our own leaders in each of our communities. And if we have leaders that we feel are saying things that just are not right, that are stereotyping, we need to stop that. I don't care what community you're in. We need to start that at home, because it doesn't work from without. That may be a good segue to the last. Robert Pirsig was an author, wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance in the 70s, I think. And after he was famous, he was out walking this Indian reservation in South Dakota, and they were walking along, he and the tribal chief, Chief Joe, he was called, and this woman. And this dog comes sauntering past them and then disappears into the brush. And the woman turns to the chief and says, "What kind of dog was that?" He thinks for a long minute, and he says, "It's a good dog." And Persig's head just exploded because he realized that we Westerners are just raised on Aristotelian logic, that if I want to understand something or someone, are they four-legged, two-legged, animal, vegetable, black, white? This American Indian who didn't have the benefit of all that education went right to what are the essential qualities that I should care about? And it was a good dog. And I realize now, if I, like Persig, that the labels I use actually define me, not the person I'm labeling. If I walk down the street and I see a black man walking towards me, and that's the first thing that comes to my mind, I still know nothing about that person. I don't know their taste in music. I don't know what their family's like. I have no idea what their job skills are. I only know that I have a mind that jumps right there to skin color. And that's okay, but I need to learn about myself from that, because I've certainly learned not a darn thing that's important about that man. And if I'm armed with that humility, I can then approach him and try to learn actually something that's interesting. And I think that also, when someone labels me, one of the ways I deflect that is I remind myself they're actually labeling themselves. They're defining themselves as someone who's either not very observant, someone who is very hostile to people different from them, but they're not labeling me because they haven't taken a moment to get to know me. And I think that would be my biggest takeaway is labels are unavoidable, but we should use them to learn about ourselves, not about each other. And to learn how my children, I tried a thought experiment once where I said, what if I didn't refer to my son as my son? And I thought, what a horrible parent. How could you even think that? But I tried it, and not with him. I just did it internally. And it was so cool because I realized there were, first of all, that my and son are both self-referential. They don't say anything about him. And I suddenly was curious about all these things about him that I didn't know because they didn't fit into the orbit of what a parent would know about their son. And I think the more when we have the time to, if you look at someone else on this call and just think for a moment about how little you probably know about them, even if you've met them several times, that all you know are the labels that you felt comfortable attaching to them, whether it's they're a stylish dresser or whatever. And I think I'll stop on that. I really think developing an awareness for how pervasive and dangerous labels are and how they can be used to control us if we're not aware. That and changing who you lunch with would be the two things I would encourage people to do.
Tina, thank you so much. I just want to say, I appreciate the bringing the way you bring social issues to light, whether they're in when they're in our culture, whether they're within our business organization or our personal organization. There are still issues that we all can be aware of. So thank you for that.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I'm also gonna just self-servingly gonna teach the label scenario to my children. I love that. I have a middle schooler, and to be able to say, those people are labeling you, but actually you think they're labeling you, but they are labeling themselves because they don't even know you, is huge. So thank you.
Welcome.
Perfect. Any other questions, comments? Nothing?
I love your presentation. Thank you.
There you are.
It was great, really great.
I thought it was very powerful too, as an African-American male business owner who's also Hispanic and has had to deal with racism and just labeling from multiple sides, whether it be, white people saying, hey, that's a black person, or even black people saying, hey, you're not really black, you're Hispanic, and then Hispanic people saying, well, you're not even really Hispanic because you don't know how to speak Spanish. And so I've dealt with it all over the world. But with that being said, I thought it was very powerful because now as a business owner, I get to be me, right? So when I sit down with somebody, I'm Alex Cardona, and it's either you're going to trust me enough or you're not. And that's what business is really fundamentally based on. And I think it's very interesting how you put those things together because it's hard to be a minority trying to build a business and knowing that one mistake, one wrong thing that you say will cancel culture is already waiting for you because they don't want you to be successful as it is. So I think it's very powerful that you were able to give people tools to say, hey, this is ways that we can kind of get over that. But then also tell people who are in those minority positions, say, hey, don't take everything that you hear as a label or as some sort of, because it may not be that. You have to be discerned. You have to discern what people are saying and what context and everything like that. Don't take everything that somebody's saying at you as an attack, because it may not be. So I thought it was very powerful how you gave different strategies, and I really appreciated your conversation on something that I think needs to be talked about more, because I don't want people to see me as, oh, he's this Black man, Hispanic man. I don't care what they see me as. I want you to see me as an individual. I'm here to do business. I'm here to help your life. I'm here to go ahead and do some things for you, and vice versa. If we can have a relationship like that, we should be able to build trust like that, independent of what you look like, more of who you are.
It's so much more fun to deal that way. I mean, it's much more fun to know someone.
Awesome. Any other comments? Great. All right, Tina, thank you so much. Annie, Anna Marie, thank you both so much. We appreciate your support. I look forward to seeing the rest of you next month for our Smart Series. Thank you. Enjoy the afternoon.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Tina.
Thank you, Tina.
Thank you all. Thank you, Tina. Thank you for giving voice to this conversation.
Thank you.